All right, so this is going to be our symbolic interactionism video, and the plan will be we'll talk about that third theoretical perspective, and then we'll also review all three of our theoretical perspectives, and then we'll talk about that discussion board post that's up next for you. And let me preface my discussion of symbolic interactionism by acknowledging my own bias. That I just think symbolic interactionism is pretty cool. And it came to prominence in the United States, while in Europe sociology was largely focused on this idea of grand theory of the macro level focuses, and you're looking at trying to come up with this sort of like grand theory of everything, right? So some sort of unified theory that's going to sort of explain all human interaction throughout all cultures and times and places. And one of the hallmarks of American sociology is that they sort of did away with that idea. They decided that was sort of a worthless pursuit, though you don't need to have this grand abstract theory of everything in order to produce good science. Moreover, getting rid of that focus actually allows you to produce more useful science, right? That this pursuit of the grand theory is a solely intellectual endeavor that doesn't really actually have much practical application. So symbolic interactionism and what we call American sociology, or what it came about in the 40s and 50s, we call the Chicago schools. The University of Chicago is where a lot of these sociologists in the United States were educated, and so it's just, that's the term. So the Chicago School, or American sociology, and pulled social theory down from these abstract ivory towers and tried to bring it down to the ground level where the actual interaction was taking place. So anyway, I admit my bias. I think it's cool. And that's probably going to come through in my talk here. But again, we're not favoring one perspective over another. They all have some benefits. They all have some usefulness. And that's what we want to do. We want to bend each of these perspectives to glean whatever value we can from them. So that's the goal. So let's get into it. So symbolic interactionism as a term was coined by Herbert Blumer in like 1937-ish. And even though he sort of coined the term, he's not really credited with the origins of the thought. That really goes to Max Weber to a certain extent, and even more so to a guy named George Mead. And Weber is one of our, founding fathers of sociology. Where he had so much to contribute. He's going to come back up in a few places as we go through the semester. So I'm going to kind of skip his contribution to symbolic interactionism now, because he didn't mean to start symbolic interactionism, and neither did Mead. But Mead's work was so influential that I think we kind of have to mention it, because if we go back to our beginning question, when we started talking about Durkheim and Marx and kind of how they differed, was this question of sort of what makes us human, what makes humans special or different from the rest of the animal kingdom or the other mammals in the world. And so if you remember, for Durkheim, it was collective conscience. It was the fact that when we live together in groups, we develop this sort of shared sense of morality, shared values, and that sort of is what makes us human. For Marx, it was our creative capacity. It was the fact that humans are the only animals that manipulate their environment. Instead of just adapting to their environment, they create space within their environment. And then, so that brings us to Mead, and Mead was more of a philosopher than a strict sociologist. And in fact, Mead didn't really write much. Mead was a lecturer, but he was such a prolific lecturer that his students ended up compiling his lectures into a sort of an anthology called Mind, Self, and Society that became one of the most trenchant contributions to sociology of the 20th century, or all of sociology. So Mead was pretty cool. But so for him, the thing that separated humans from the rest of the animal kingdom was language, really language and thought, and the fact that we think in language. So again, like, animals communicate, and they vocally communicate, right? They dogs bark, and that means something, and animals make sounds as a way of communicating something, but it's not language. It doesn't rise to the level of language. Humans are the only ones who actually communicate in this thing called language. And even more significant is the fact that we actually think in language, right? So, not to get us too sidetracked here, but as Mead says, that voice in your head, the voice that's talking, when you talk to yourself in your head, that voice is communicating to you in language. It's kind of weird. He separates this idea of the I and the me, and this is the thing I don't want us to get too bogged down in. But the I is that voice in your head, and it's communicating with the me. So you yourself are sort of this kind of microcosm of self-communication, and the fact that that communication happens within language is extraordinarily significant. So let me pull up a few things that are going to hopefully help us make sense of this. So if you look, you'll see the graphic on the left there, and you've got these three things, and these all come from the work of George Herbert Mead. Language, meaning, thinking, that they're all sort of connected, and they're all sort of part of this same process where that we would call sort of social construction. So let me try to just kind of break this down a little bit. So remember that symbolic interactionism it has an individual level focus, right? And so that means that the focus is on social processes more than it is on social structures. And so some of the key things are this idea of the social construction of meaning, right? So humans act toward things on the basis of the meaning they ascribe to those things, and those meanings are derived from social interaction. So even if we're not talking about human beings, we're talking about the way we interact with literal objects. So, what makes a trash can, for example, right? Any sort of vessel that could potentially hold garbage could be a trash can, right? But only certain things actually are trash cans. And just depending on the situation that you're in and the way you and the people around you are interacting with that object is whether or not that thing becomes a trash can, right? That's kind of a crude, example, but that's how broad this idea of symbolic interaction is, and the idea that we're constructing meaning through interaction. Let me pause for a second. So social constructionism is a really large topic, right? And it's really hard to just kind of gloss over it so quickly without delving into it a little bit more. But we don't have all the time in the world to talk about what we mean by social constructs. But I do want to kind of address one example that came from our reading from this week, in our reading on symbolic interactionism. It just real matter-of-factly tossed out the idea that gender is a social construct. That it has no biological basis. And that's true because gender is different from biological sex, right? So gender is the socially constructed presentations of masculinity and femininity. But then there is also biological sex, which is obviously, a practical reality. And it's really kind of sometimes very difficult to kind of separate the two. And we'll get into that. We're going to have a whole chapter on gender later in the semester. And we'll also have another whole chapter on race where we talk about the difference between the biological realities and then the socially constructed realities revolving around race. But that's all part of this process, right? Looking at social constructionism as a process. and as opposed to looking at it strictly from this like kind of macro level focus on structures and institutions. Social constructionism is really focused on processes and how we come to ascribe meaning to things like as significant as gender and race, or as mundane as what is and is not a trash can, and which side of the road are we going to drive on, and when it's raining today, so that's what I'm thinking about it. When it's raining and you don't want to get wet, versus when there's a pool right there and I definitely want to jump in that pool and get wet, right? So like meaning is so subjective, and is it's a negotiated process, and we arrive at those meanings through these processes of interaction. And one of the most important processes by which we come up with the meaning is when we come up with our own identity or self-concept, right? This is all part of our of a larger process of social construction, where we can kind of construct an idea of who we are, and that is very much an interactional process, right? We define ourselves, we come to think of ourselves on the basis of or through interaction, right? The book mentioned a guy named Cooley, who talked about the looking glass self, and that's the idea that we see ourselves through the eyes of others. We see ourselves through how we think other people see us. And George Mead had similar ideas that identity is a social construct, right? That we come to this idea of who we are, and we adapt and change the idea of who we are based on our social interactions. And these next few points I wanted to raise, I think I've already mentioned, right? I've beat this to death, right? That we're talking about social processes as opposed to structures. Language, again, how important language is to our identity and to this process of social construction, because language is how we communicate, it's how we think. And so in some ways, and we'll talk about something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, anyway, it doesn't matter. But our vocabulary has a great impact on our capacity to construct meaning. We'll talk more about that. Again, then that voice in your head uses language. So literally everything we understand, we have to understand in terms of language. And then emotion. Emotion is a key theme to symbolic interactionism and to micro-level sociology. That was really overlooked for so much of the history of sociology, and I think probably has a lot to do with the fact that men were the ones who were responsible for all of the theory for the first 100 years of the existence of sociology. But by the 80s, 90s, and much more recently, emotion has come to play a prominent role in sociology and in what we study. So again, this is my final thing on symbolic interactionism. It is really broad, right? So this isn't this sort of constructed framework, this like fixed paradigm by which you're collecting information and sorting information. It's not so much a unified theory as it is something that you use to develop more theory. It is so closely tied to methodology, to qualitative methodology, and we're going to talk about that next week. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there. So I'm sharing this slide with you, and this presentation is attached to the video module of Blackboard, so you can look through this. Again, this is just kind of a brief history of symbolic interactionism and how it came to prominence in the United States. Again, as a micro level approach, it was often kind of shunned by the old school sociologists back in Europe. Again, Herbert Blumer coined the phrase, and Herbert Blumer was really big on this idea of methodology, and that methodology and theory should not be disentangled, right? That you can't sort of say, here's a theory and then here's my method of studying it, because then that it creates this sort of circular reasoning thing. And then if you've got this theory that everything in society, like in functionalism, you got the theory everything in society serves a function and is part of this organism that we call a society, then yeah, you're gonna find confirmation for it everywhere you look. Same with conflict theory. If you say everything is defined by this by class conflict or by conflict between different groups competing for influence, resources, whatever it may be, if that's the theory you're working with, then absolutely you are going to find all sorts of evidence for that. They become these self-fulfilling prophecies. So Herbert Bloomer is one of my favorite sociologists, because he wants to pull sociology down from these lofty heights of academia and right down to the ground level where we're actually observing what happens. And then and that has to do with grand theory, right? Your old school sociologist, Talcott Parsons, is one that your book has mentioned, hugely influential and really important. But again, his main goal was to find this like grand theory of all social action. And, guys like C. Wright Mills and Herbert Bloomer came along and just said, man, that's worthless. Just forget about it, man. You're never going to find that sociology should be grounded in the mundane, which is one of my favorite ideas, is that sociology is about seeing the strange in the familiar. So you're seeing something that happens all the time, like people throwing things away in a trash can, and you're like, well, how did that particular receptacle come to be recognized by everybody as a trash can? There are other objects of similar shape that we don't use as trash cans. How is it that thing comes to be recognized universally by everybody that walks by it as a trash can? That's wild, man. That's crazy. And that's sort of symbolic interactionism in a nutshell. I know that it's a little bit weird. Again, it's not this unified theory so much as just kind of a way of looking at things and a way of discovering strange things about familiar processes, about familiar interactions, things that we see all the time, and looking at it objectively and saying, now, how did everybody come to decide that sloths are cute, right? Like three-toed sloths. And yeah, I love sloths, right? They're just cute as they can be. I got a picture of one in my office. That's what made me think of it. I love sloths. What about sloths makes them cute? What about that aesthetic, right? There's nothing like biologically inherent about aesthetics, right? These are, or about taste, right? Some people like really fancy, expensive wine. Other people really like Budweiser. Really like, what is the difference? How are we constructing this idea of taste? So, all right, that's my piece on symbolic interactionism. Again, not so much this giant theory, so much as a method of coming up with new little micro theories all the time. All right. This is an inserted edit because I realized that I forgot to mention one really important thing about symbolic interactionism, which is the definition of the situation, or the sort of the power of the situation over you. So we talk about how social structures or social forces, right? Not necessarily social forces, and symbolic interactionism, it's more social processes, but they affect your decision making. They limit how actually like free you are, right? So we're not like totally free to do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want, anytime we want. We are constrained by social structures and social processes. So the situation, right, that we are in is a key process and a key moment in that sort of negotiation of what things mean and how we interpret meaning given the situation, right? So one thing can mean one thing in one situation and can mean something totally different in another situation, right? And there are tons of examples of this. Let's just look at something like from the world of deviance, right? Uh, there are some places where drinking a beer is totally outside of the realm of normal activity. It is a shocking thing, right? If I was sitting in my office right now drinking a beer while I teach this class, that's a problem, right? That's a problem. That's not okay. We're because of our definition of the situation, this being a professional, educational interaction, right? We define that situation in a way that makes the consumption of alcohol during it very much a deviant activity, right? But in other settings, in a bar or at home, I don't know what y'all. I've like back-to-back weeks. I've mentioned drinking beer. I don't know what that says about me. Whatever. Anyway, in other situations, it's far more appropriate and expected and natural. So just remember that. So the situation has a lot to do with the meaning we interpret from different objects and different interactions, and even how we see ourselves. Right, we might see ourselves differently. We might identify. Right, that self-concept that we talked about. Right, might change a little bit depending on your interaction, where you're at with, or if you're at church and you're talking to your minister, or whether you're at home talking to a parent or a child, or whether you're just kind of hanging out with friends or meeting a complete stranger, and whatever the case may be, the way you present yourself and indeed the way you conceive of yourself might change a little bit depending on that situation. So defining the situation is super key. All right, and so this is our review slide. As promised, we're going to do a quick review of all of these things and try to. And I think when I reviewed the video of functionalism and conflict theory, I was really caught up on the guys, on Durkheim and Marx. So I really want to take a minute now and really kind of pull that back from the history of the theory and really talk about like why it matters and what it means in practical terms, right? So for functionalism, the key is the organismic analogy that every part of society has a function, has a role to play to the overall whole, right? So you think of it as the organismic analogy is like every part of the body, right, has some role to play to help us function in a healthy and productive manner, right? The heart, the lungs, the stomach, whatever, it all functions to produce a human being, right? So in the same way, all the different parts of society have a role to play, have a function to play. Even something like deviance, right? Even something like crime and deviance has a role to play in society that helps contribute to this idea of a collective conscience and nurturing our shared values. Conflict theory, right? Again, Marx is the main guy, but pulled back from that, the idea is that social structures are oppressive. Social structures tend to serve the needs of the valuable or of the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, right? So the key term here is exploitation, right? And again, the system is the exploiter, right? So conflict theory, especially in modern conflict theory, is really focused on structure problems within that are embedded in systems and maybe embedded in institutions. And we'll talk about institutions. We've got a whole chapter on institutions. We'll talk about what exactly I mean by that in a few weeks. But again, it's not about bad people doing bad things. The system is the exploiter in conflict theory, right? And now, again, originally conflict theory was seen as mostly an economic theory, right? We conceived of the class conflict that we saw. Class was defined, Marx defined class in solely economic terms. It wasn't long before we started defining class on other things. Weber, which we didn't even talk about this, but Weber added some extra dimensions to this idea of social class. And then other theorists have added to and refined that. So we have this really a kind of multifaceted idea of what social class is, which expands our idea of how class conflict occurs and how lower classes or working classes can be exploited by the more powerful classes. But again, those are done through the system, not intentionally by the people in those upper classes or in those more powerful classes. That's an important part of it. So conflict theory, again, a traditional conflict theory, all based on economics and economic exploitation. Modern conflict theory is more nuanced than that, but still, I think economic exploitation and economic vulnerability and wealth creation and wealth gaps and income inequality, these are still kind of hallmarks of the largest and most prominent ideas within conflict theory. And then finally, symbolic interactionism. While functionalism and conflict theory are both macro level theories, they're looking at big picture, large social structures. Symbolic interactionism is a micro level theory, and it is trying to analyze processes as opposed to structures, which means it has a very interactional focus, right? It's really focused on individuals and how individuals behave and interact depending on the situation, right? We're talking about how meaning is interpreted through this process of interaction and how we ascribe meaning and how we come to think of things and how we come to define certain things as having certain roles in society. Again, I'll go back to my mundane illustration of the trash can, right? What makes this particular cylindrical object a trash can and this particular cylindrical object, I don't know, a water bucket? I don't know. Again, it makes sense. You can see that they've been designed for an express purpose, but work with me. Work with me here on this analysis, right? Depending on the situation that they're in and depending on the way people are interacting with an object, the nature of that object and what that object means and how that object is used can change. And then also emotion is an important aspect of symbolic interactionism. Tied into symbolic interactionism is the idea of social constructionism. So just keep your eye out for that. We will talk about this idea of how social structures are constructed. And so social constructionism is a process. So symbolic interactionism is really concerned with the way things are constructed in society, the way these social constructs come into being, and the processes that develop them and sustain them. Whereas conflict theory and functionalism are more concerned with the after effect, what happens because of these structures. So they work together, right? We need all of these perspectives to help us have a full understanding of everything that's going on, or as much as we can understand what's going on in our society and in our culture. All right. The last thing I want to discuss today in this video, while I've got your attention, is the discussion board where we're applying the perspectives. Hopefully, it makes sense to you when you read through it. But there's a ton of issues. These are just things that I kind of came up with. Don't limit yourself to this list, but we want to see how you do applying these perspectives to real world situations, real life issues and subjects that we might have thought about, right? And so we just want to kind of try to take things that we've already thought about, but put them in the terms surrounding book theory or symbolic interactionism. I'm only asking you to do a couple. So pick the couple that you're most comfortable with, that you feel like you understand the best. Or if you want to do all three, I'm not going to stop you. But there's some questions here to kind of help you orient your thoughts before you start writing. So when you start thinking about, and I don't want to give away too much, right? But like I did an example of unemployment. So when you think about something unemployment, that seems like kind of a net bad, but you know, how does unemployment help create social stability? what function does it serve to broader society? And it certainly does have some function. But of course, the consequences are probably felt by some people more drastically and more badly than others. We can analyze that from a conflict theory perspective and really make some sense of the varying consequences of unemployment on individuals and on people and on groups. And then, of course, symbolic interactionism, depending on your situation, depending on your place, you may experience unemployment very differently. Anyway, read through my example. Hopefully it makes sense. But if you have any questions, if you're not sure how to go about this, just shoot me an email and we'll talk through it. We'll figure it out. We can set up an appointment and meet through Collaborate Ultra or through Microsoft Teams if you need to if it would help you to talk through it, or just exchange some emails and kind of write your way through it. The key thing with this is something they didn't teach me this until I got to graduate school. But the writing process and the learning process are linked, right? So I used to think, you're doing a research paper and you do all the research and then you learn some stuff and then you just the writing part is just where you're recording it. But actually, as you write something, as you work through it, as you put it into words, right? We talked about the importance of language and constructing meaning, right? So as we're taking something from an abstract concept and putting it into words, we're actually processing that information and we're learning it. It's part of the learning process. It's part of the process by which we become very familiar and comfortable with a subject. So that's one of the reasons I want you to write. It's part of the learning process. So that's what I got. That is what we're looking at for this week. So please let me know if I can help. I would be happy to.